Well, I'm excited to be with Jeff Hancock from International Justice Mission. And Jeff, already you get the award for the best background of any podcast that I've done. So thank you for that. But
It's nice to start out at a high.
start out at high. You're the director of church mobilization for IJM, International Justice Mission. And you have an MDiv from Gordon Conwell. In your former life, you were a pastor. You live in Atlanta. But much like me, you read that first book out of the chutes for IJM. Mm-hmm. And I confess to you that when I read it, I was on a beach in Mexico crying and wondering how I didn't know about these sex slavery situations and human trafficking situations. And I was just stunned. I remember going to dinner with my wife that night saying, what is going on? Mm-hmm. But people are living in poverty and uniquely vulnerable because the local justice systems are not equipped to protect them. And so they're at risk of trafficking and slavery and violence against women and children and police abuse of power. Talk to us about what I think most business leaders in Europe, in North America are not familiar with, because we cannot treat our team members, our employees unjustly, unfairly. We cannot violate the law or we find ourselves fined and or in jail. But that's not how it is around the rest of the world. So help us understand.
Yeah, no, thank you, Greg. And I would say you're not the only one who read that book and was spending some time in some inopportune places in tears. I know that was definitely the effect on me. Though I would say the other side of it, and I know we're going to get to this side of IJM's work, but the other side of it was that there's good news that resides even in the really uncovering the truth about violence and injustice in our world. And that is that we actually get to do something about it, which is pretty exciting. But I had that same experience of it sort of changing my life. And I think like you, and I think many of us, the issue of slavery, I think it feels like some sort of relic from history. I remember the first time really encountering knowledge of slavery. I remember it in school, and you see those diagrams of the boats of human beings really, sort of stacked like cordwood. They are products, and being so shocked and thinking, wow, if I lived then, I hope I would have been the kind of person who would have stood and done something. But a part of the reality that drives IJM's mission is that we really do live in those times. That while the great sort of emancipation and abolitionist movements of the US and the UK largely eradicated slavery in those places, in many ways, slavery really sort of crept into the dark corners around the world where the laws weren't enforced. And that really is the issue. Around the world where slavery exists, especially where it exists in scale. The truth is that slavery does exist everywhere. It's on every continent. It's right here in the US. And it needs to be and is being dealt with. Where IJM's work is really where the justice system maybe isn't as equipped to be able to partner in the further eradication of that. But just to give us, I think it's probably helpful just to pull back a little bit and give us a little scale to realize that when we think about the issue of slavery, the Walk Free Foundation is kind of the best estimates right now are about 50 million people enslaved around the world. And somewhere around half of those are a part of labor slavery, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about today.
Wow. I would love to do a survey of North American business leaders and say, how many did you think were enslaved? And I feel like you get numbers like 1 million.
Absolutely. Yeah, the scale of it, and even thinking about it in business terms, again, sort of best estimates are just in terms of dollars, that labor slavery is about $150 billion a year industry. Which,
Wow.
of course, you put that next to the sort of profit scale of other major corporations, and you see the massive footprint, I suppose, of slavery around the world.
Well, we have a rule of law, as I alluded to, in the United States anyway, and in Canada and Mexico, in Europe, in most civilized countries, but there is no rule of law in some countries. And even if there is a rule of law, it's being skirted. So I feel like we can say the word slavery, and people think, oh, that's too bad because somebody doesn't make as much money as they should. Or, oh, that's too bad because somebody had to work for a month to pay off a debt.
Right.
But let's put it in shoe leather, in real terms, because the real story is absolutely mind-boggling and horrific. So what happens when a person in a particular country, Pakistan or Nepal, or I don't know what country, but whatever country, somebody has somebody's in trouble with a factory owner, and then what happens?
Right. So, and it's a great way to sort of set the stage in many ways, because it is an underlying vulnerability of communities in poverty. They are, and I am going to just pull back one moment just to say that, you reference a couple of times that sort of the rule of law, the experience for many of us, maybe most of us who are going to be listening to this, who live under the protection of an effective, not a perfect, but a functioning justice system, right? But again, estimates show us that about 5 billion people today in the world live outside of the protection of the law. They live in what's called the justice gap. And so
that's 5 billion, just so people know, out of now 8 billion people in the world. So the majority of the world.
Exactly. And so these are places where, and it's hard to paint it in broad strokes, but if you do look at that, broadly speaking, these are places where, simply put, the local justice either isn't or is unable to enforce the law. They are unable to protect victims and surround the victims of violence and injustice in a victim-centered way that actually brings restoration, and unable to sort of break these cycles of violence. And one of the phrases that we often use in terms of describing our work is everyday violence. And when we're saying that, we really are just distinguishing it between the kinds of violence like the violence of war, which is a whole different category, and thankfully, and the world needs to keep obviously working on eradicating that as well. But this is in many ways a sort of hidden violence that communities in poverty experience every day. And what we've found is that it actually creates a sort of cap or a ceiling on the effectiveness of other aid work and other wonderful efforts that go into these communities. So many of the organizations and efforts that I suspect many listeners of this will already be supporting, of reaching into communities and trying to bring a rebuilding and an upbuilding of those communities. What we find is that the violence of trafficking, of violence against women and children, sexual violence, all of these things really put a cap on the ability of those other efforts to ever bring sustainable change, to break those cycles of violence and the cycles of poverty. What we're really trying to do then is address that underlying reality of violence, because we believe that in repairing that justice system, we actually strengthen the efforts of everything else. And so it is that very real thing. If we can raise the effectiveness of that, then everyone is raised up, and that's what we're really after. So just to drill down a little bit then, and this probably is obvious from what we've already said, but one of the things that we do find is that these crimes of violence, and specifically forced labor slavery, flourish where the rule of law does not. It is crystal clear that these are especially in terms of trafficking. These are crimes of profit that business owners, they choose to enslave a workforce because it makes them, in some places, just marginally more profit. And so we work in places where, like our presence in Ghana, where we work on a lake where there are tens of thousands of young children enslaved in a fishing industry, where their workday may look like 14, 16, 18 hours a day of dangerous, hard labor. I know that one of I guess the benefits, or one of the things that we are really celebrating at this stage of IJM's life, is that we've been around about 26 years. And so we've actually got to see then a fuller cycle of restoration, and a little bit of more of a picture of the full story of some of the people that we have had the privilege of being a part of their rescue. And so one of the young men, and again, I think this can just sort of drive it down a little bit, was a young man named Kumar, who was, as he was growing up, again, experiencing much of the poverty that many of these communities are. He was very close to his dad in particular. When he was young, he lost his parents. And that part of his story of something happening that sort of moved him over the line from vulnerable to now victimized. And what happened with Kumar is that a local business owner illegally held the very minor debt of another relative against Kumar, and brought him in and forced him to work in his brick kiln. And so that kind of idea, that sort of debt slavery, we do see in many of the offices where we work. And as you mentioned before, this isn't simply, hey, I borrowed $50 from you and now I'm going to mow your lawn a few times and now going to pay it off. The reality is that they are never able to pay it off. As soon as they come in, and when it's time for their pay, they're charged for the food and for the housing, and on and on and on at these exorbitant rates. We've actually had the experience of rescuing third generation slaves, meaning that their grandparents borrowed the money. And that cycle again of abuse and victimization. Kumar was one of those who went into an existence of violence and forced sort of backbreaking labor, that in many ways, I think as we talk to the people who come out of that kind of existence, it is everything you think of in your mind as slavery. That's what it is. Again and again, we find that the people who have come out of that existence were either themselves directly assaulted physically, sexually, or at the very least witnessed that many times over. That threat of physical and sexual violence is used to keep the workers in line, and keeps them from going out, even if they were able to, and trying to find help or rescue. Kumar was one that IJM investigators were able to identify. We went in with our partners on the ground in India, our police partners, and facilitated that rescue. Kumar was rescued, was restored, and began a long process of restoration. The people who come out of these kinds of experiences, as you'd expect, they need a long period of aftercare. And so that process started for Kumar. And again, this is what I was alluding to at the beginning with the length of our time, is that Kumar actually began to really develop this passion for learning in school. And he got passionate in particular about social work. And so he began to study social work. He then sort of circled back and now actually leads some of our own efforts out of our IJM Bangalore office. So this, what could have been yet another cycle of violence and victimization and sort of despair, in a way, for this young man, was broken along the way. And then the resilience of Kumar and the people surrounding him have really led then to this sort of cycle where now Kumar, who was once a slave, is now facilitating the rescue of other slaves. And we see this sort of extraordinary cycle of restoration and rescue start to happen again and again. We globally have a network of global survivors who are helping to lead our efforts, helping to become advocates, but also helping to really also shape what we're doing in some of these places.
What I think I just heard you say, what I know I just heard you say is so unimaginable. You're basically saying that for a small debt,
right,
that I might have, my son and his grandson, his son and his son will be enslaved for 3 generations.
Right. It's definitely, many times it's something as small as we've witnessed many times where somebody may want to pay a dowry for their child being married, and they don't have the money, and they borrow the equivalent of somewhere between 35 and 50 US dollars. And that very small debt becomes years and years and years of backbreaking labor for that person.
And just to keep putting reality checks
right.
to this, somebody might say, well, work in a brick kiln, rice factory, rock quarry can't be the worst thing in the world, but that's not true. So what does a day look like for these people?
Right. Well, it's another one that I think does sort of stagger the imagination. I know that when I've had the opportunity to talk with some of my colleagues there, some of the places where, again, this is not a 8-hour workday with a few breaks and a lunch break. These are often, again, 16, 18, 20 hours a day in places. We've had the experience of people working. Their child became sick. They aren't allowed to leave to take the child for medical care. In one of the cases, the child, actually a young child, I think she was about 3 or 4, died. The worker was still not allowed to take a break and had to work the rest of that day with the body of their child beside them. And so there is this reality for these people that not only, and again, it's not just the labor, though that is enough. That is slavery. They are forced to do this, and the power of that business owner is being abused to take away the good things that were meant for that worker, right? Because a part of what I think we all believe is that we inherently as human beings deserve the right and fair reward of our labor. That's being stolen from these people by forcing them to work. And the other reality, as I said, is that so often physical, sexual violence, fear, intimidation is used again and again and again. And so, people know that you don't escape because they know for a fact that the person who did last year, in one of the cases that we worked with, had their hands amputated by the factory owner. And so it's not simply a slighter, longer workday or just unfair working conditions. It goes well beyond that discussion, which is important in and of itself, but this is a whole other discussion.
I'm sure IJM has thought about all these corollaries, but my mind goes to what we're trying to do in Convene, which is we're saying to business leaders, you need to do great work. You need to do excellent work. You need to be profitable. You can't have a business that glorifies God if you have no profit. It's called bankrupt and out of business.
Right.
So you have to do excellent work. You have to love people and value people and bring dignity and worth to people, because that's what Jesus did when he was on earth. He taught us to bring value and dignity to people groups and people who were marginalized and people who were hopeless and people who were dying. And he brought dignity and value and worth to people. And work, the Bible says, do all to the glory of God. That includes work. That just doesn't mean Sunday.
Right.
And yet, as we in Convene teach people to bring glory and honor to God through the Monday to Friday work day, it's very hard to imagine how a worker can reflect anything good when their wife is being raped. They're in the third generation of slavery. They're working 20-hour days. They probably have medical issues, and work is this oppressive, terrible, awful thing. So it is aberrant and abhorrent to God, right?
Yes. Yeah. And, one of the things that you all talk about, that Convene talks about, is using our lives, our businesses, to cause the flourishing of those who are in our circle. I think that is exactly what we're talking about, because when we, I know that the words justice and injustice have become sort of fraught in our divisive conversation. That's not the same conversation. When we talk about injustice, we're really thinking about a very specific kind of sin, where the Bible describes it really as the abuse of power to take the good things that God intends for another away from them, life and freedom and the fruits of their love and work. Flip that on its head and say this, that the work of justice then, and the work to which we as IJM are trying to enter into, and that the whole of the church, and I actually think the whole of humanity, is invited into, is to leverage our power, whatever that is, as an individual, as a business owner, as a spouse or family member, however you want to view that, to leverage our power to cause the good things God intends for others to flourish and grow in their lives. And in particular, of course, I think the church is called to do that for those who are most vulnerable.
Wow.
And so that really is our work. That's what we were trying to do with Kumar. But I would also say, and going back to that good news about injustice, is that we're watching it work not only for the lives of individuals, but at scale.
Is there any examples of someone who was a slave owner coming to faith in Christ and saying, I'm not doing this anymore? I mean, wouldn't that be an incredible day?
Right. I will say, it's not the easiest question for me to answer. I suspect you would be able to get a clearer answer from some of our colleagues in the field. I will say that we know many survivors, including Kumar, who has come to Christ because, inevitably the question comes out to aftercare workers, why in the world are you doing this for me? And they answer. I do know, and this is more anecdotal than, sort of being driven by hard data or anything, but I do know that in one office in particular where there was a justice conference in one of the area where children were enslaved in an industry, and they were really calling them out. And one of our local church partners was really helping us do that. That a man stood up in the middle of the thing and said, I own a boat. I have multiple kids in bondage. I'm going to release them. I'm going to tell my friends they have to do the same. I suspect there's much more than that, but I will say that because of the nature of our work that is working with the justice system, when that perpetrator enters the justice system, our focus in terms of the restorative process is really on the victim. I think a part of it is simply that we are one link in God's redemptive chain in these areas. And so I feel like what we've tried to do throughout our history is stay in our lane and trust that the other places are going to be cared for.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, you put even 5 unjust business owners together in whatever country in the world, and we will come as Convene and we will help them understand that God has a better way.
Absolutely.
But, I was thinking of the verse Isaiah 1:17, which I know is probably part of IJM's thinking.
Sure.
Where the Bible and the prophet Isaiah says, learn to do good,
right?
Seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's case, etc. So if I'm American or Canadian, North American business owner, European business owner listening to this podcast, And I might say, well, listen, I'm following the laws in my country. I don't know what I'm supposed to do about it.
Right.
They are supposed to do something about it, right?
Sure. Yeah, I think we all have a role to play, and I think that one thing I didn't mention earlier is simply that sort of in a nutshell, that I talked a lot about the sort of victim and the restoration of the survivor part of what we're doing. And we alluded to the fact that everything on the ground that we're doing is really in partnership with the local system, because our goal is really about building in capacity and restoration to that system. That means working with all kinds of partners, right? So everything you think of as the justice system, of the police, the prosecutors, the judges, helping to build up capacity, helping to provide expertise or training or companionship so that they are really owning the weight and able to do the thing they are established to do, which is to protect their people. It's also, though, partnership with multiple sort of actors and constituents within the community, from civic community leaders to business leaders to the local church. How are we sort of moving and leveraging all of those forces to protect the vulnerable? I say that because I really do believe that the work of justice takes all of us, I should say. And so that for a business owner in the US, I think of course a part of our responsibility, and I would say that I think that you would say that the standard for those for your members in Convene is obviously sure, don't break the law, but obviously you're asking questions that go beyond that. And so I do think one really important thing is to sort of take that question of justice and injustice to ask yourselves, as a business owner, are there times when our own workplace, maybe, whether that's internally in our workplace or our presence in our community, are there any places where our power is actually being used to take things away from somebody else? Or that obviously the other way is in moments where we're really wondering about strategy, when we're wondering about places we're going to invest next, when we're wondering about everything from, layoffs to the next 10 years of vision and strategy for our businesses. How are we leveraging our power and influence to cause goodness to flourish for our workers, for our community, for our world? I think those are often different lenses that are really helpful to add on to our other strategic lenses that we're making those decisions about. I would also say that from the investment side, there is a very real and important effect of investing in places that are intentional about trying to clean up supply lines and trying to actually adhere not only to the standard of maybe the US state where they're headquartered, but what happens in the field. And so kind of doing due diligence on the places we're investing, that actually really matters. We're watching over the last years corporations really step forward to partner with us directly to help examine and eradicate trafficking from their supply chains. And yes, this is, I think, driven by the sort of moral, ethical vision of some of those corporate leaders, but it's also driven by the reality that they don't want exposure to that because it hurts the bottom line. And so all of that's fine with me. Everything that's moving us in the true and right direction. So I think we have power as investors as well. And then I think the other side of it is in addition to the sort of questions we're asking as individuals, as businesses and investors, I also think it's, where are the places that you can invest in real kingdom change that you can have confidence are effective? And so the supply line side of things, the corporate side of things, that is incredibly important in eradicating labor slavery. But part of what we've kind of already covered is the reality that when there is just a total lack of accountability on the ground, it is so easy to interrupt that process. So just one little illustration, I hope it's helpful. It was incredibly helpful for me. Just in terms of needing both sides. So On a charcuterie board, the little pickles, the gherkins. Okay. When you look at a jar of those gherkins sitting on your grocery store shelf, next time you do, be reminded of the fact that we were told at one point that somewhere around 7,000 different farms, small farms, would have fed into the supply chain that provided that jar of pickles in one particular store. And each store has its own different, each brand, I should say, has its own different supply chain. The reality is that from the sort of corporate side alone, you can't police all of those things. You need partners on the ground who are actually bringing a safe and stable business practice on the ground, taking away impunity from perpetrators and protecting vulnerable people who are also the workforce in that place. Those sort of combined efforts are what's really going to bring sustainable change. And so I'd say also really look for the places where you can invest the fruits that God has entrusted to you and entrusted to your stewardship to invest in real change.
Cool. Well, I want to give a shout out to somebody that that I know, former Convene member before they moved to a city where there was no Convene. That's Blythe Hill, who started this idea in her sort of mind. One day she said, what if I wore a dress for the month of December? And I gave all the money that my friends supported me for wearing this dress to sexual trafficking, human slavery, etc.
Right.
Blythe Hill and December has raised millions and millions and millions of dollars for trafficking. And we're pretty proud of her as a Convene member.
As you should be. She is a dear, dear friend and partner of IJM and has been a part of, again, leveraging whatever influence she has to really bring resources to the fight, to really, bring, again, not only rescue to little kids, individuals like Kumar, but actually seeing massive, scalable reduction of trafficking around the world in whole communities. She has been a long partner in that fight.
Sweet. Well, we're talking to business leaders. They're probably saying, well, is this just an ideological discussion or has there been some results? And there has been some results you've tracked since 2014. Talk about that.
Yeah. And that I would just set it in the context of that everywhere we work, we are driven by data because ultimately we want to make sure what we're doing actually works. Our goal is to be able to leave because we're not needed anymore. And so we are not looking to implant a sort of temporary US solution into a different system. That's not what we're after at all. In our offices, I think about 98% of the workers are national to that office. And what we're trying to do then is check everything we're doing to make sure it's working. And so I know that you and I talked about one of the instances, which was at an office of ours in South Asia that we've been in a long time, working in sort of low scale industries of all sorts, many of the kinds that we've mentioned already. And we've actually been there. I think I want to say it's like 15 years or something. So it's longer than this, but in 2014, a study was begun, and our studies and data are all either done by or verified by external sources. And this study ended up showing the kind of result that we've actually seen now in multiple places around the world, that when you can end impunity of perpetrators, when you start to build up societal community confidence within a functioning justice system, what you see is a dramatic drop off of the crime. And then as that crime starts to go down, as the violence starts to go down, and you see now a system that is able to support victims in a trauma-informed way, that's able to keep accountability of perpetrators, that's able to continue to build this confidence, you see this cycle of a more and more effective and sustainable justice system. And so in this office, the one you're referring to, it was an office that was focused on labor slavery. And in those 8 years, the study was completed in 2022. What we showed was an 82% reduction in labor trafficking. Now,
Wow.
that IJM was a big part of that, but a part of, again, of our model is partnering all over the place. So this was other NGO partners who had adopted the model. These were robust and courageous police and government forces really joining in this work, all to, again, accomplish this 82% reduction, which, taking it out of only numbers and talking about human beings, what that actually means is that over the course of those eight years is that 380,000 human beings were moved from slavery to freedom.
Sweet.
As a part of this whole collaborative effort. And so that's really what we mean when we say, we rejoice in the story of Kumar, but we're also so encouraged to see this change happening at scale. And again, we've seen that now in multiple places around the world, where we've seen between a 72 and 90% reduction in the crime that we're working on. And much more important, or maybe as importantly, I should phrase it, is that there's now a sustainably strengthened justice system, which starts this sort of flywheel, right? That makes the other work of justice, the other work of aid groups, investments, the work of the church to really build a flourishing in these communities. And that's really what we're after.
That's amazing. Well, if somebody's listening and they thought that their good work here in North America for making sure their employee benefits package was strong.
Sure.
And they've now heard that there's no employee benefits in some of these places. As a matter of fact, slavery is multi-generational. It includes horrific things and horrific working conditions, 20-hour days, rape of daughters and mothers, and just unspeakable things. And they're saying, I'm feeling like that Isaiah verse applies to me. I should seek justice. I should let justice roll down, as Martin Luther King Jr. said. And so what should they do? Where can they go? You have a website for us to connect to.
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is, for us, as we look at this next season of Vision, as we've really seen this model work, our next season of Vision is really driving towards saying, okay, how do we actually scale this? Because again, what we are really about is protection. We don't want the crime to happen in the first place. We want future generations to not deal with the reality of slavery as a force in human affairs. It may exist on some level, but we really believe like we can actually affect sustainable, dramatic change. And so when we think about our next season of Vision, we are really aiming at the protection of 500 million people, which is a huge scaling of what we've done. We are going to need partners who walk with us. And that's how we've gotten this far, honestly, is courageous, generous, wonderful partners who've walked with us, like Blythe, and who have walked with us in this. And so I would just say, if you're interested to dig in deeper, to learn more, we would love to have a conversation with you. You can go to ijm.org/connect, and you're just going to give us, there's a ton of information on our website where you can dig in, but there's also just an opportunity to give us your name and email so we can just be in a conversation if you're interested in that. I promise I'm not going to show up on your front porch or anything. It really is about having a conversation around what partnership could look like.
Great. Well, Jeff, it's been, oh gosh, what do I want to say? Eye-opening to hear all these stories, but I think appropriately so, because we can't be uninformed. We can't turn a blind eye to what God very clearly is not okay with. He's not okay with it at all.
Right.
And so if you're listening and you are a person who's never heard of Convene, we are a place that says we want you as a business owner, as a leader in your company, to be a person who understands the kingdom of God is about justice and is about value and dignity and worth for employees. And when you love on employees, which is completely the opposite of what we've been talking about for half an hour, but when you love on employees, you actually get better performance from employees.
Absolutely.
The Harvard Business Review, Harvard Business School studied it, and they call it the service profit chain, that when you love on employees, you get better results and better performance. And when you don't, you don't. And what you're talking about, frankly, is a horrific, aberrant, terrible, awful version of the Harvard Business Study, that when you enslave people, you get no results because you are confining them to slavery to the detriment of their very lives.
Absolutely.
And so what IJM is doing is bringing these cases around the world, these countries around the world, to a place that is right and true and good and just and beautiful. And I applaud you with it. So if you want to find out more about IJM, as Jeff has talked about, ijm.org/connect. If for some strange reason you've never heard of Convene and you're interested, if you're a CEO or a leader, you should go to convenenow.com. And we look forward to talking to you. Thanks again for coming on, Jeff.
It was such a pleasure. We're just so excited to be in friendship with you all. So appreciate the time.